All right, howdy y'all. Welcome to Accessibility in Aggieland. My name is Dr. Megan Orsag. I am Associate Director at the Center on Disability and Development here at Texas A&M, and I will be one of your facilitators today. I will be helping with the chat function and also introducing our speaker. And I would like to also introduce my co-facilitator, Dr. Christy Orr. Dr. Orr, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. My name is Christy Orr, and I'm the Director of Disability Resources here on campus, and very happy to be collaborating with Megan on our whole Accessibility in Aggieland series, and super excited to learn from Dr. Laura Stow, who I know has done incredible research in this area. And so I know I am ready to learn about something that I don't know a lot about.
Yes. Thank you so much. All right. Dr. Stow, I'm going to do a short introduction, and I'd love for you to fill in the gaps for me because I know I don't have enough time to even share all the accomplishments that you have. Dr. Laura Stow she's a professor in the TLAC department in the College of Education. She is also an assistant director for our Center on Disability and Development. And she's associated with the Hazard Risk Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M as well. She serves on many national, international, and state and local groups that address the topic of disaster and disability. She's sought after in many realms as far as disaster and disability. Her expertise is exponential. And it's just an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today, Dr. Stow. And I'm going to hand over the mic to you.
Thanks so much, Megan and Christy, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll let you all know that my plan is to have a pretty quick paced presentation to allow time for question and answers. At the end. I'm not very good at monitoring chat while I talk, so you know, we will leave it to the end, and then you know, if you can assist me, Megan, in figuring out where the questions are, that would help me out towards the end. So I am going to screen share, and I'm going to ask for Megan to give me a thumbs up if she sees the screen. Okay, it's always a little do-si-do here, making sure that everything lines up appropriately. So the focus of my talk today is about how disasters actually unveil a host of inequalities and what we as an Aggie community can do about it. And as Megan said, I am, as is Megan, affiliated with the Center on Disability Development. I'm actually in the Department of Educational Psychology, not TLAC. so just for any colleagues that are in one of those two departments, yeah, I'm still in educational psychology. And I've been with the center since its initiation in 2005. So I have been researching disability and disaster ever since I started with the center. And previously, my training was as a disability scholar. I was a special education teacher. I was a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer and special ed consultant in Costa Rica. But what changed things for me was Hurricane Katrina. And I was on sabbatical and seeing the events that occurred, looking at the disproportionate impact, in particular on people of color during that time, made me really question kind of this whole issue of equality and disaster. And then, of course, given my background in disabilities, led me to question what were the experiences of people with disabilities, and was there any research out there on people with disabilities? And the answer was there was very little. And so when I returned from sabbatical, I thought, you know what, this is what I'm going to do now. I am going to focus on this area. And so that's what keeps me busy day after day. So this afternoon, I'll be discussing 6 different points followed by a Q&A. Again, I will move kind of rapidly through my presentation, but the recording will be available as well as these slides so that you can refer to them later. Some of you may have come to previous sessions on accessibility in Aggieland and may have more knowledge about disability than others. But some of you might appreciate a little general overview. There's a lot of different ways disability can be defined. Department of Education, HHC, the Association of Psychologists have different definitions for disability. But what we'll stick with for the purposes of this presentation is how the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability. And what the ADA says is that a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or major life activity, or who has a record of such impairment. For example, some of you may wear hearing aids and be legally deaf, but you have the history of having that disability, or who is regarded as having such an impairment. For example, populations with HIV may not be actively experiencing symptoms, but there may be the perception by society that they do have a disability. So when we talk about major life activities, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about functions or activities that are central importance to daily life, to all of our daily lives. Things such as caring for ourselves, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, speaking, and then relevant to the university community, learning and working. And so a major life activity that can be affected by disability is learning and working. And the Americans with Disability Act protects rights and also mandates that we provide accommodations in many of these cases. So the flip side, let's conceptualize disaster. Well, most of you are here in Texas, I assume, and you know that Texas, we have lots of disasters, and we have lots of different kinds of disasters. And what you see here is flooding on Galveston Island, starting in the upper left, hailstorms, you see buildings in downtown Houston following Hurricane Ike. And yes, this is the major freeway from Houston to Galveston Island, and debris and boats that were washed up during Hurricane Ike. And Texas receives the largest amount of funding from FEMA because we have the largest amount of disasters. We're geographically large. We have some erratic weather, and these photos are only examples of some of them. You know, we have tornadoes. We had the Great Texas Freeze, right, in February. So lots of things going on in our state with respect to different kinds of environmental hazards. So I use that word hazard because that's the term that we use in disaster research. We don't talk about disasters making things happen. We talk about hazards such as tornadoes, hurricanes, etc., causing a disaster, right? And so those kinds of hazards, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc., would be considered environmental hazards. There's also chemical disasters, technological disasters that are caused by chemical hazards or technological hazards. And then we have the most recent ongoing hazard, that very small microscopic hazard called COVID-19, which has overwhelmed our community's ability to protect public health and safety, to promote psychological and social safety, and ensure economic and political viability. And so that's how you can conceptualize what a disaster is a hazard occurs, and the impact, the scope, the intensity of that hazard is such that it overwhelms the community's ability to respond and protect citizens. In conjunction with talking about hazards and disasters is the concept of vulnerability. And when we talk about vulnerability, we're not talking about something innate to me or to a person with underlying conditions or to a person with a disability. We're talking about physical, social, economic, and environmental factors that place humans at risk, that make humans vulnerable. So just to clarify, that some of these hazards place us as humans at risk and make us vulnerable to disasters. And that kind of conceptualization comes out of the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. It's a new way to talk about disaster and hazards. So this is the disaster cycle, and kind of different versions of this disaster cycle have been used since for a good 50, 60 years, and they've taken different shape. This is one of the most recent ones, but it serves to illustrate what are the different phases of disaster. So if you look at this slide at the oval on the right-hand side at preparedness, these are the things that we do to try and avoid or lessen the impact of disaster, right? Having a go kit, having your batteries charged. But then in between this oval and the next, that little arrow, that's when the hazard occurs. And if the hazard overwhelms infrastructure and the community, then you have the response phase. Now, the response phase is that really telegenic, photographic opportunity to take pictures of people in floodwaters or debris or whatever. It's very photogenic, but it's actually a very short period of time. It's where you are protecting people's lives or healths, or taking cover or immediate shelter. But typically the response phase is one of the shorter parts of the disaster cycle. Following that is the longest phase of the disaster cycle, which is actually recovering for disaster. And recovering from disaster can take months. In some cases, it can take years. For example, we still have families and households recovering from Hurricane Harvey that occurred in 2017. So I'm saying this is typical, but right now we're still kind of in this arrow and response to COVID-19. We're not in the recovery stage yet. Hopefully soon, but you know, this virus, sometimes I think it's smarter than we are. Following the recovery stage is the mitigation stage. So the mitigation stage is where you make changes to infrastructure, to practices that can help you avoid the impact of disaster. So these could be things like putting on a better roof on your house, getting insurance to protect your property. These things are things that if a hazard does overwhelm your personal circumstance or your community, that it is going to make your community and your household more resilient. Okay, so that's kind of the language being used in emergency management and recovery. Now, there are legal aspects to that guide emergency management practice, primarily the Stafford Act, and that is the act that authorizes federal assistance when the president declares a state to be a disaster area. So a disaster occurs, the governor typically makes a request to the president for federal assistance. When that is approved, that's when FEMA moves in. Okay, but it has to be requested by the state. Now, Section 308 also protects individuals with disabilities legally. It protects individuals from discrimination on the basis of race, color, nationality, sex, age, and disability. So this means that these federal resources and responses need to be free from discrimination, so that all Americans receive equal access to disaster and rescue services. So here's my area, research on disability and disasters. And you know, having been in this world pretty intensely in the last 15 years, it's been really exciting seeing new research come out. However, the findings that we see with respect to how disasters affect people with disabilities are frankly not very encouraging. What we see is generally people with disabilities have higher mortality rates. They're more likely to die in a disaster. They're also more likely to have higher property loss. So when their households are impacted by disaster, they lose a disproportionate amount of their property, of the value of their house. They're more likely to incur injuries. And you can think about this if you are a person who has limitations in running or jumping or crawling, and you're trying to quickly evacuate from a tornado or a hurricane, this can place you disproportionately at risk for injuries. Added to that, we see more health-related complications, especially for people with underlying conditions or health-related conditions who cannot reconnect with their disability-related services or their medical services quickly after disaster. We also see that people with disabilities, they need additional support needs during evacuation and sheltering, so that they have accessibility to those services at the same rate. But at the same time, what we see is within sheltering and evacuation, people with disabilities tend to receive less rather than more assistance from emergency management and volunteers. It's as if they are just kind of overlooked. And of course, disabilities are not always visible. There are a number of people, types of disabilities that are not, you know, I think people not familiar with people with disabilities tend to think of, you know, wheelchairs or canes for people with visual impairments, but a large number of people have disabilities that are not seen, people with developmental disabilities, people with different kinds of learning disabilities, people with TBI. And so these populations certainly can be mixed as well during evacuation and sheltering procedures. And then what we know from our research here at Project Red at the Center on Disability and Development is that the recovery from disaster of these individuals, it's more complex, it needs more intensive case management, and it's just longer. it's longer. So, you know, we could leave it here, but there's kind of a story behind this story. And that's that disasters do not impact everyone equally. You might have heard that in kind of mainstream conversations that, you know, disasters don't see differences in people, but they actually do. We see differences in how people are impacted. And in the case of people with disabilities, the loss and the severity of that impact is disproportionate. So post-disaster, these individuals and their families, they start the recovery process 2 steps behind, rather than 1 step behind. And then the question follows, well, why is that? Well, the deal is that even before disaster, like think back to the preparedness phase, even before you know, the first raindrop falls and the hurricane makes landfall, people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and relatedly be unemployed. And this holds true across the majority of the US when you do comparative studies. Also, they're more likely to live in floodplains. And you would think, well, gosh, why is that? Well, land is cheap in floodplains. And one of the things that we saw post-Hurricane Harvey is the households that were flooded disproportionately included people with disabilities. They were more likely to live in housing in areas that was more at risk. Added to these factors, limited access to healthcare. So if you're starting out with healthcare concerns and then a disaster occurs, there's lots of barriers during disaster to get appropriate healthcare, and the delay or the complication of your symptoms really can be substantial. And then also what we know is that many people with disabilities have smaller social networks. And this has to do with mobility into different sectors of society. This has to do with needing more supports in order to go into different places, different buildings. And what that means is post-disaster, they have smaller social networks to call on during recovery. So what we know right now as a university community, we can predict that people with disabilities on our campus are very likely to be disproportionately impacted by disaster because we have these existing inequalities, right, in our community, in our state, in our nation, that place some people at risk. Okay, so disasters do not impact us all equally. They impact those who are poor, those who are vulnerable, those who are stigmatized to a greater extent than people who do not have those factors surrounding them. So, you know, I've said that I've been working in this field for about 15 years. There's been more and more advances. And yet in Hurricane Harvey, maybe some of you saw this photo come across social media about residents in an assisted living center in the Bella Vista assisted living center south of Houston. And so literally these floodwaters entered into the assisted living center, placing people who were already vulnerable at risk. I think this case of this assisted living center also highlights the unique vulnerability of people who live in congregate or group settings. And if you think about that for a minute, it's because the ratio of people with high need to people who provide assistance is really great. And also the intensity of the needs of a group of people that are all together in one place. And then just the crowdedness of living in group situations. And here at the university, we have students who live in housing here on campus. They're close together. They are perhaps not as familiar, well, they're probably not as familiar with emergency procedures as our faculty and staff. They may not have a lot of experience with different kinds of hazards and emergencies themselves. And so this is something that we need to take into careful consideration at the university. So we do have some research on how disasters affect school-based settings. And so most of this research is on elementary and secondary schools, but some of it does apply certainly to our current setting in that, you know, colleges can be places that are impacted by disaster, especially here in Texas, right? And also in the case of some disasters, intensive storms, tornadoes, you know, colleges can be places where people take shelter. So people walking around campus are going to take shelter in our buildings. Similarly, we have used university facilities to provide a large-scale medical shelter. So we do provide these services during disaster. And so having more knowledge amongst the university community of what are the implications of this is certainly really important. At the same time, schools and colleges are sources of resources and information in times of disaster and during recovery. And this is certainly something we worked really hard on here at the Center on Disability and Development, is getting information out there during Hurricane Harvey, during COVID, about different resources and information that individuals and their families might need. Also, schools and colleges are places where disaster preparedness education can take place. And we have the good fortune of having the Hazards Risk and Reduction Center here on campus. And so that center is educating our next generation of urban planners and emergency management. So more similarities than you would think to what goes on in schools. And so because of that role, we have the responsibility to ensure whole community preparedness, drills, evacuation, and sheltering in place. So this idea of whole community comes from FEMA, and it's the idea that you're providing services to all, right? You're including all segments of the population. And again, the special issues surrounding people with disabilities have been kind of late to the table with respect to how we make accommodations and what we keep in mind. But they are certainly at FEMA concerned about including the needs of people with disabilities as part of the whole community. So I've been talking about people with disabilities as if they're kind of, you know, other or outside my door or something like that. But actually most people with disabilities live in the community. They work alongside of us. As faculty members and staff, they are members of our student body. If we live long enough, we are very likely to acquire a disability. As a matter of fact, once you reach about age 70, age 70, it is about 1/3 of the population who will acquire a disability. And if you think about perhaps your own parents or grandparents, you can think, yeah, dad's definitely, deaf in one ear, or grandma really does have mobility impairments. And those two areas, mobility impairments and hearing impairments, crop up early as in the trajectory of aging. So it is not, I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about people with disabilities as something out there. People with disabilities are us, and actually might be part of our identity and our future as we go through life. However, the needs of people with disability are also often excluded in school disaster planning. And it's a continual push by advocates and disability experts to ensure that the needs of students are considered in this planning. Part of the hard thing is in our role in response and mitigation, we ourselves can also be affected by disaster. And of course, we're experiencing that right now. It's not just our students that are experiencing COVID, it's us and our families as well. And yet at the same time, we have this role of continuing to provide essential support to students and to families. Studies on school teachers of children with disabilities have pointed time and time again that despite being impacted themselves, these professionals continue to offer important support, information, and networks to people with disabilities. And I think that my colleagues on the faculty and staff feel a similar commitment to supporting the safety and well-being of our students on campus. So that's why it's important that we are trained, and important that we're trained across contexts. What we found in a 2019 study of school-based disasters is that kind of what we had in our heads was that disasters affect school buildings. Well, school takes place in a lot of different ways in a lot of different contexts. And certainly here on campus, we have students participating in extramural activities, in student-run organizations, being just being on campus, taking transportation, and all of those functions that we provide as a university in those different contexts also need to be examined that they appropriately serve students with disabilities as well. So, we're living through this hazard and this disaster called COVID-19, and something that really comes into highlight is that college and schools are facing many of the same challenges as congregate living settings. And as I mentioned earlier, we have students here who are living and working at close quarters. You have a large number of relatively young people who may need direction during evacuation and sheltering, the transmission of COVID occurs, what we now know, more rapidly when humans live and work closely together. And so together with that is that students and faculty, we commingle across many demographics, right? We're not just here at the university, we're out at Bryan College Station, we're in supermarkets and churches, etc. And so it's not that we have just this bubble at the university that we can isolate. The members of our community are commingling out there with older adults in the community and with people with disabilities who live in the community. And so part of the concern too is we're here inside buildings, inside classrooms for extended periods of time. We share space, equipment, services. Some of our buildings are old, and we have poor air circulation in buildings. For example, I can't open my windows. You probably can't either. And what we know is that open air and fresh air really helps decrease the airborne transmission of COVID. So those are realities that we're faced with here on campus. Also, we have a large number of students who are younger, who are emerging adults, and they may not understand the importance of taking protective measures, not only for themselves, but taking in mind that we have commingling of university students and personnel across multiple demographics in our community, again, including people with disabilities. So lucky for me in this talk, a great publication came out in just this past August in Nature Communications, a very high impact journal. If you're a faculty member, you know that's the kind of place you want to publish. And the study looked at spread in university settings and found that COVID spreads easily in university settings. And, you know, just given what we just discussed, you probably said, well, yeah, they didn't have to study to find that out. But they did do a scientific study and they did find this out. And they found particularly first-year students experienced the highest rates of COVID infection. But here's the deal. Given the age distribution of first-year students, right? They're younger, they tend to have asymptomatic infection. And I'm sorry, there's a mistake there. It should be asymptomatic infection. So students did not show that they were infected, and yet there was a high rate of infection among these students. And of course, why do young people go to university? Well, in part to be around other young people, right? And it's a time of life, emerging adulthood, where young adults do want to commingle with other young adults, and peer relationships are extremely important. However, what that means is that it's not the students that are at risk. It's faculty, staff, and the surrounding community that are likely to experience higher levels of morbidity. And what we know from studies on people with developmental disabilities and COVID, they're more likely to die at 2 to 5 times the rate of people without developmental disabilities. So this has repercussions for the disability community when you have young students who may not be wearing masks, practicing social distancing for the disability community, in that these behaviors can cause risks to vulnerable groups and people with underlying conditions. So this tells us a lot about how human behavior, protective actions can be really instrumental in decreasing the impact of certain hazards like COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit about campus preparedness and emergencies. If you're like me, I log into www.tamu.edu on a weekly basis. And if you scroll down to the very bottom, you can see that there is a link to emergency services there at the very bottom of the page. And when you click on that, you have the university instructions on what should you do in an emergency, what should you call, what are numbers that are available, what are basic kind of things you should do if an emergency occurs on campus. And if you look further on the right-hand side of that page, you see this kind of box, and there are some great links there to the emergency plan the university has, to emergency procedures. But up at the top, you have Code Maroon, where you can sign up for text alerts in the case of emergencies on campus, which is really a great little resource there. The problem is, if you're like me, I ask students to turn off their phones, right, when they're in class. And so, and certainly when I'm lecturing, like right now, I'm not looking at my phone, I have it on silence. And so there are other things that faculty members need to put in place to be able to get these kind of notifications while they're in classrooms with students. However, no matter what kind of service the university offers, regardless of who operates a shelter or a program, it must be conducted in a way that offers people with disabilities the same benefits and access as provided to people without disabilities. And again, that's part of ADA. That's part of the Stafford Act. We have to provide equality in access to services. So here's a couple of ideas that I want to suggest with respect to preparedness in office and classrooms. I think step one is to contact your building proctor for the emergency evacuation or sheltering plan. And Jamie Neff, I saw her attending this presentation. She just sent out our plan along with a optional sheet that you can submit saying if you need additional assistance during a disaster due to a medical condition or underlying condition. And so your building proctor knows what your emergency plan is and takes steps to make your building as accessible as possible for egress or sheltering in place during disaster. But if you're a faculty member or if you're the director of something and you have a lot of meetings, perhaps you need to think about what you do during classroom instruction. How can you get those Code Maroon alerts? And then also, what the heck do you do if an emergency occurs in your building during class? And a number of years before Jamie was our building proctor, we lost electricity in our building. And I'm on the 7th floor. I was instructing at night. It was dark. lights went out. And so my students, we sat there for a couple of minutes and they said, okay, you know, I guess we should leave. And they all started packing up to leave. And I said, no, wait a minute. We evacuate together. You are you're under my wing right now. We are going to evacuate all together and then get out all together. As we went down the stairwell, there was no lights, none. And smart students we have at A&M pulled out their phones, had those little flashlights, and that was terrific that we went down those stairs together with that light provided by a couple of those cell phones. So anticipating those procedures you might need during classroom instruction, it might not be evacuating the building, it might be sheltering down in your basement. So knowing those are really important so you can direct students, so you can provide them with instructions, so you can provide a little bit more organization during these procedures. Also anticipate procedures to assist colleagues that you might have on your floor or students working on your floor that you know have a disability or underlying condition. Some of these individuals may not want to submit to their building proctor that they're going to need additional assistance. If you have a personal relationship with somebody that you think could need assistance during evacuation or sheltering, go ahead and ask them about it. There are so many cases, most heartbreakingly in the World Trade Center, of people with underlying medical conditions who could not evacuate, and because they could not evacuate, died in those disasters. So part of this is, yes, we have university procedures, but we also need to take personal action because really it's we that are the first responders. We're right there when these things happen. And so taking that responsibility could really make the difference for someone. And then develop procedures and accommodations for your own sheltering or evacuation. So knowing these procedures and what you yourself has to do, and making some of those arrangements. You may have seen, you know, these kinds of emergency kits and that procedures for sheltering, you know, in your home, say something like 3 to 7 days of supply of food and water and medical supplies and documents, right? Well, you know, think about it. You know, many of us are spending, you know, 8, 10, 12 hours a day in our buildings. So what kinds of these supplies do you have at hand? Do you have a couple of bottles of water? Do you have some medications? Maybe do you have some basic kinds of first aid supplies? You know, I make sure that I always have a couple of snack bars, and that really comes into handy if you're going to be sheltering for a while, and you know it's lunch hour. So think about, do you need a little kit in your office in the case that you are stranded in your building for a while. Also think about departmental or center emergency preparedness. Simply, you can include emergency preparedness as an agenda item during departmental or center meetings. This came up about 10 years ago in our own center. And we knew that we had students who had mobility impairments, and we needed a vacuum chair. We needed some way to assist people down the stairs if the elevators were not being used for evacuation. So just raising the issue as an agenda item and having that discussion as part of your departmental or center meeting can lead to some really simple ideas that you can put in place. And then in many buildings, you not only have a building proctor, you have somebody on your floor who's responsible for evacuation and sheltering. On our floor, for many years, it has been Kathy Watson. But during one evacuation, I knew Kathy Watson was not there that day. And I went into the department, and then I thought, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to be the person going through the floor and making sure nobody needs assistance getting downstairs. Knowing who that person is, also being ready to assist that person should they need that. And then having a conversation with them. Again, do you have colleagues who might need assistance? Think about approaching them. And then finally, remember your own family, okay? Part of preparing is preparing your own family, preparing members of your family who might have disabilities or underlying conditions. In the current pandemic, keep yourself healthy. Don't come to work if you're sick, but also don't get sick at work and bring it back to your family. So taking protective measures on campus can also protect your family members and also members of the disability community who are disproportionately at risk for COVID. And then if you are serving in any of these functions with respect to emergency procedures, have backup support for your own childcare and family if you're going to be in a role in disaster response. If you're going to kind of take the lead on these issues, make sure that you have things set up with your own household so somebody else is able to take over. So different layers of protection, keeping yourself safe, thinking about your department, thinking about your students are all kinds of layered protections that can really assess. Some of you may be involved in community-based collaboratives. You might belong to churches or to volunteer groups. With respect to protecting people with disabilities in disaster, what we really want to see is reaching out to both organizations that provide disaster services, Red Cross, voluntary, but also disability organizations. And so what we like to say is, how do you reach across? If you are working on Meals on Wheels, that might be operative during a disaster. How do you connect with local disability groups? If you're a member of a long-term recovery group, how do you connect up with our local Brazos Valley Center for Independent Living? Okay, so thinking about in your own community work, how do you reach across the divide to include your work with people with disabilities? So I'll leave you here with kind of an overview of different tools and supports that our center has for people with disabilities. Kind of the central hub is our Project Red webpage at red.tamu.edu. Project Red focuses on research and education on disability and disaster. Isn't that cool acronym, RED, right? And I direct that project, but have lots of support from people within the center, graduate students and other colleagues over the years, but this is where we have a lot of this information. Most recently, we have developed the READY directory, which had a number of different funders, and it's based on a database of over 1,500 disability resources. But what you'll find there in the READY directory are resources and services for people with disabilities recovering from Hurricane Harvey, because yeah, they're still recovering, and for COVID-19. So that is accessible at dcr.tamu.edu. You can have general disability resources, but also specific to disaster. It looks like this. We just renovated it with support from Technology Services in the College of Education and our crack team there. And you can use the drop-down menus to look for different kinds of disability related services. And you can even get it geocoded by zip code on that search. We also have a list called the Texas Guide to Supports and Services during disasters. We also have an app called the Mobile Tip for first responders, so that mobile first responders can go for information on how to interact and communicate with people with different types of disabilities, and also to find resources and assistance during disaster. Post-Hurricane Harvey, we developed a long-term disaster recovery toolkit that similarly looks at different functional needs. And then with respects to COVID-19, we just got finished disseminating information this past summer to emergency management and to disability organizations about different kinds of accommodations and modifications for self-hygiene and social distancing for individuals with disabilities. So all of these things, they're on Project Red at red.tamu.edu. So there you go. You know, again, there's my name and my contact information. And I am ready to entertain any questions.
So Laura, we had a question near the beginning about when you were talking about how disasters disproportionately impact people with disabilities. And the question was about the higher property loss and whether that was due to the higher cost of disability equipment being lost and damaged, or if there were other reasons. We did have one person who shared that many people are living in places where flooding happens, like you talked about with the floodplain. And so there is worse damage because of that. But I wonder if there are other factors that you might be able to share there.
Yeah, great point. Some people with disabilities do use durable medical equipment, wheelchairs, assistive devices that can be lost during disasters. But specific to property loss, the disproportionate loss is because the tendency of housing for people with disabilities to be disproportionately placed in floodplains. And so when flooding does occur, then they are more likely to lose property. And by property, I'm meaning their home, their roof, the contents of their house.
I wonder too if there could be times where, depending on what the disability is, being able to address whatever the issue is that is happening. So if there's, you know, a pipe that's burst, being able to turn off the water to be able to stop the damage from occurring, you know, may not be able to happen. And so then the damage could be worse. So I think there's a lot of things with disability that are very complex and multifaceted that impact, you know, that definitely some of the living in a place that is less expensive, like you talked about, because we see more unemployment in disability communities. There's so many different layers that happen for people with disabilities that impact them. The other thing I think something that you kind of had made a point about, but I wanted to kind of bring home to people who are maybe thinking about, if they don't have a disability themselves, how are they helping other people? And you mentioned this, and I think one point to make would be, disabled individuals usually have to have their own plan, but you can help them figure out what those instances are where they may need to address that. So helping them think about, you mentioned making sure you check in with someone to see, you know, if there were a disaster, how can I assist you to make sure you can get out of the building, or that sort of thing. So I think helping them understand the bigger context of what they might face so that they develop a plan. I know we've been asked in disability resources before from time to time if we could give a list of people who are wheelchair users in certain buildings or something like that. And kind of the point is we can't, because anyone who uses a wheelchair could be in any building at any time. So we don't want to go looking for them when they may not be in their residence hall, or they may not be in Harrington, or whatever building it is that's having the disaster. So I think it's really important for people to understand that individuals need to have their own plan, and then you can actually be helping them understand that bigger context, and then assisting them if they need help.
Yes, but interesting, the research is kind of mixed when you look at disaster preparation in populations with disabilities. Some findings are that they are more prepared, but there are even more findings that they're less prepared. And so that's unfortunate, because as I've just presented, their tendency to be more vulnerable in disaster. And so you think it would follow that people would be even more prepared. But then again, think about what that preparedness looks like. We just got finished with a couple of studies on the California wildfires and evacuation of families who had children with moderate to severe disabilities. And these parents described evacuating from the wildfires, and they had to bring, you know, their child's assistive device, the wheelchair, special diet foods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in explaining that, it really hit home for us how much more involved the evacuation process was for these families.
It's making me think too, Laura, when you were talking, something I hadn't thought about before is during that recovery period, how much more some people with disabilities are impacted when other services are not available. So, you know, if transportation is impacted, it may be that someone else could say, oh, I'll just do that a different way. But if I have a disability that means I rely on public transportation and that's impacted, you know, it's again disproportionately impacted as I wait for those services to become available again.
Right. And, you know, having accessible infrastructure and returning infrastructure to its pre-disaster accessibility is really important because of the sensitivity of some people, or the reliance on that infrastructure, transportation. And you know, just think about if you are really good at mobilizing and have a visual impairment, but you have a tree that's fallen down or a bunch of debris on the sidewalk, right? So that can really, it really does prevent sometimes people with disabilities staying in their own home or returning to their communities post-disaster.
Laura, this wasn't necessarily a question, but there are several people who are part of either emergency preparedness committees and accessibility committees within their own academic units. What is a good way for them to start the conversation to make sure that accessibility is the utmost, you know, important on their plans, or to start talking about planning? What are some suggestions that you might have for those who are participating in the meeting today about going back into their committee meetings to talk about disability and inclusion of disability in their emergency preparedness plans and accessibility?
You know, just having the knowledge that your students, staff, and faculty with disabilities are very likely to be disproportionately impacted should a disaster occur. Just having that knowledge and bringing that to light is powerful. Of course, we want, in the case of an emergency, that everyone has an equal chance to survive the emergency, right? Having that kind of mindset, that we want to provide services that serve the whole community, right? And also in groups that have less familiarity with people with disabilities, I like to have them think about their own parents or their own grandparents. And that makes people start thinking, oh yeah, how would my grandma get into the bathtub and take, cover? And could she get out afterwards if she did that, right? How does my dad, who has severe hearing impairments, how does he get information from emergency alerts? What kind of alerts are there? So having people think about people that they know, whether they be members of their own family or members of the staff or faculty, I think makes a big difference, because still people with disabilities are discriminated against. There's stigma, and removing that kind of conversation that people with disabilities are other. No, there are parents, there are grandparents, there are spouses. I think also can reduce barriers, psychological barriers to adapting accommodations.
Laura, I really appreciated how you pointed out that we are all first responders. And I love that. I think that was brilliant. And something that Christy and I have talked about is accessibility is all of our responsibility. And so I think that just tied really nicely in with the theme of why we are hosting these accessibility webinars. And so I love that mentality, and I love that truth, and that we are first responders. And what do we need to do as an individual or as a group, to provide access and inclusion is so important. And I can't thank you enough for all the work that you're doing. And it's definitely fun to go to meetings when, people talk about Dr. Laura Stow, and thank you for all you do. Does anyone else have any questions in the chat function? I know it was very loud for Christy, so I'm going to be helping her with the chat function. I'm going to post a link in the chat function, but before you do that, Dr. Stow, do you have any closing remarks, or perhaps any upcoming events, or anything else that you think that this group might want to know in moving forward?
Yeah, each of you have come to this session for different reasons, and probably because you are sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities and other marginalized populations. And I think it's such an important time for us to continually bring to the attention of others how our actions and how our protective measures make a difference for people with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you everyone for attending today. Like we mentioned earlier, this webinar recording will be available to you on our website on Friday. And we thank you, Laura, for joining us. I know you're so busy, and so we just thank you for sharing your expertise and providing us with a knowledge base so that we can move forward and make some change on campus and beyond. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending today.